Well, it's an imposing title. The book is about the question of whether there exists such a thing as what I would call history with a capital H. We usually associate history with just the routine flow of events, you know, the war in the Persian Gulf, the fall of the Berlin Wall. But my book tries to ask a larger question, whether there is such a thing as a history of human society, taking into account the experiences of all peoples and virtually all times, and whether there is a kind of coherent evolution in the nature of those societies as they progress from, you know, very primitive agricultural, tribal societies up through various monarchies and aristocracies, up to the kind of liberal democracy and technologically driven capitalism that we have today. And the end of history refers to what I think still remains a question of whether that process is one that can terminate, whether that evolution, you know, finally culminates in a certain kind of civilization that in a certain sense will be the, you know, the last civilization that mankind will achieve, because in a certain sense it's the, you know, it's the right one, it's the one that fits human nature in an appropriate way. And what I argue in the book is that liberal democracy comes much closer to fitting human nature in that sense than virtually any type of prior, you know, form of government or political organization or social organization. Well, you know, I think part of the problem is simply a matter of misunderstanding or misinterpretation of what, you know, what the end of history represented. You know, the book that I've written grew out of an article that I published in a small magazine called The National Interest 2 years ago, just prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall, when all of these great events were happening in the Soviet bloc. And, you know, what I was referring to was really the growth of a kind of universal consensus on the, you know, the justness or the rightness of the principles of liberal democracy, that was really the remarkable fact about our world, and certainly not that events would somehow, you know, cease to happen. But I'm afraid that, you know, what happened was a lot of people, perhaps including people like Paul Johnson, you know, simply saw the title and they said, well, what's this? I mean, it's absurd, you know, history is not going to end. You know, we still have wars and poverty and, you know, a lot of struggle in the third world and things of that sort. So, you know, prima facie, it's an absurd thing, and there's a lot of controversy simply over, I think, the misinterpretation. But underneath that, there really is a more serious question that, you know, it used to be that there were many alternative forms of government, monarchies and fascist dictatorships, and, you know, for many years we thought communism was our, you know, major rival, an alternative, you know, type of civilization. And one by one, in this century, every one of those has collapsed. And, you know, not every country is a liberal democracy. There are many dictatorships of the right and the left remaining. But, you know, as a systematic idea that has some dynamism and some real vitality, liberal democracy is really all there is now. And we've seen that now in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, that communism was in a sense undermined by the fact that people did not believe, you know, that that was a viable form of government, that it had no legitimacy, and that in fact democratic ideas were, you know, the primary ones that people found, you know, exciting and just and you know, and worthy of emulation. Well, it's an important distinction. I mean, democracy, we have a good sense, you know, it means something like elections, multi-party, you know, secret ballot elections. But the kind of society we live in is a liberal democracy. It's elections plus guarantees of certain, you know, fundamental rights of individuals, like freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of political association, and most importantly, the freedom to participate, you know, in the political system. And so, you know, a true liberal democracy has to have both, you know, the election side of it and the constitutional or legal guarantees of individual rights. And when those are brought together, I think you have, you know, the essence of contemporary political systems. Oh, sure. In fact, there are a number of them now appearing in the Islamic world. And for instance, you know, Iran now, Khomeini's Iran, or the post-Khomeini Iran, you know, I think can claim the title to being a more or less democratic country. They have elections of a sort. They're not the fairest elections, but there are elections. But, you know, it's absolutely an illiberal country. Women don't have rights. They can't participate in the political process. There's no freedom of religion. There's certainly no freedom of speech. It's a real, you know, problem in many parts of the Arab world. For instance, in Algeria right now, you're having the struggle between a fundamentalist Islamic group that really, I think, is very likely. I mean, it was expected to win a majority in the election that was taking place. Now, democratically, they were elected, but their program is not liberal. I mean, they have no intention of guaranteeing things like freedom of religion and freedom of speech, and it's a real, problem in that kind of society. If they're elected to power, the first thing they're going to do is to disenfranchise a certain part of the population. And so, it's very important that democracies be liberal democracies as well as, simply based on popular sovereignty. I was born in Chicago, 1952. Only 2 years. I really grew up in New York City, and then at that point began wandering to various places like a lot of Americans. I went to school at Cornell and graduate school at Harvard. As an undergraduate, I had a very unusual major. I majored in classics. I spent 5 years learning Greek, essentially to be able to read Plato and Aristotle in the original, and studied a great deal of political philosophy at that time. I got a PhD at Harvard, but at that point I had switched fields, and so I was in political science in the government department there. Well, it was a very unphilosophical subject. I wrote on Soviet foreign policy, or Soviet foreign policy in the Middle East. Well, my father worked for many years in the National Board of the United Church of Christ. He is, by background a minister, and then later he became a professor of religious studies at Penn State, and then went on to the Chicago Theological Seminary in Chicago. So he had gone to the University of Chicago originally and then returned for full circle in a certain sense towards the end of his career. And my mother, met him originally at the University of Chicago, but at that, later was a mother and a housewife. I live in Washington. I've spent the last couple of years writing this book. I'm a resident consultant at the RAND Corporation, which is one of the oldest think tanks doing, foreign policy, national security kinds of studies. And that's where I worked before I moved to Washington, where I did studies of Soviet foreign policy and Middle Eastern politics, that sort of thing. I have worked in the State Department. I was there twice. I was there in the early 80s. On the policy planning staff, which is it's a small office that's attached to the Office of the Secretary of State that's supposed to give advice on, long-term foreign policy, ideas. So I was there in the early 80s, and then I returned in 1989, and I was a deputy director in that same policy planning staff. But my second State Department career was cut a little bit short by the publication of the original article on the end of history, which led me to write the book. The State Department had nothing to do with it. It was a completely voluntary decision. I simply thought that writing the book would be an opportunity in a certain sense that would be very hard to pass up. Whereas you can be a bureaucrat anytime you want. Well, I had written the article actually when I was at the RAND Corporation before coming to the State Department, and it was in the works when I came to State, and then all of a sudden in the summer of '89, when I was serving official, it was published, and then all the, the hoopla and reactions to it started. So I was in the department at that point. No, I was working indirectly for Secretary Baker at the time, and he took a very, I think, tolerant attitude, as did my immediate boss there, by ancestry, yes. Well, my mother was born in Japan, and she came to this country in 1949, and my father was born in Los Angeles, and his father came in 1905. So it depends on which side of the family you go back to. Well, it's a table showing the growth in the number of liberal democracies around the world all the way back to the 18th century, and it really shows a kind of long-term and I think a very widespread spread of democratic institutions. Well, what's left is most of Africa, most of the Middle East, and the southern two-thirds of Asia, and then you have China and Russia, or the former Soviet Union, which is going through a very traumatic process of democratization. But altogether, I count something in the, it depends a little bit on how you define a democracy, but something in the order of 60 to 63 democracies in the world, which is about something like 2.2 billion people, about 40%, a little more than 40% of the world's population. And that compares in 1790 to only 3 democracies, France, the United States, and Switzerland. So the progress of the spread of democracy, if you take a sufficiently long-term view of it, has been really, quite remarkable. It's a progress that has not been linear or uniform, because we've had, tremendous setbacks, like in the 30s, under the impact of the Depression and the looming, outbreak of fascism. Many democracies were overthrown in Europe and elsewhere, and again in the 1960s and 70s in Latin America. You had many democracies that were overthrown. But what the table, I think, shows is that, we tend to take a short-term look at the little, peaks and valleys. But if you take a longer-term view that looks at the last 200 or 300 years, it's very clear that there is a worldwide trend towards democratic government. I really have 2 very separate explanations that I go into in the book. The first really has to do, in a way, with economics. That if you look around the world, there's an extremely high correlation between, stable democracy and prosperity and the highest levels of, economic development. So if you look at Western Europe, Japan, North America, these are all areas that are both, highly advanced technological capitalist countries, and they're also very stable democracies. And that indicates that there is some kind of a correlation between, a country's ability to industrialize in a, in an advanced way and its ability to sustain democracy. And I think you can account for a lot of the, the underlying cause of many of the recent transitions to democracy in Spain and Portugal and, in many parts of Latin America, certainly in the Soviet Union. It does have to do with the fact that as economic development occurs, as a country industrializes, as it becomes more urban, it becomes therefore more educated. You create a certain kind of middle class that, is raised and trained, to be literate, to, take an understanding of their own affairs. And, ultimately, I think people like that, a middle class society like that begins to demand a certain degree of democratic participation. And you can see it in a variety of countries around the world. In South Korea, the military dictatorship was finally overthrown in the late 1980s, and that came at the end of a period where it had gone through a remarkable, period of economic development. It developed, it's, say 10, 15 years behind Japan in terms of turning itself into a modern, consumer society. And I think at a certain point, people in Korea started to say to themselves, well, it's ridiculous that we have this kind of military government. We want to be able to participate and to, be a democracy like the rest of the developed world. And, there are other cases of that. So that's one explanation that, forms one of the pillars, in a sense, of my argument. But, the other one is in a way, a more philosophical one and somewhat more difficult to understand. These economic explanations for democracy, I think, are ultimately not really satisfying because, in the last analysis, people don't want democracy for economic reasons. I mean, you can have, a high-growth society without a lot of political freedom. I mean, there are a lot of countries in Asia, Singapore and Thailand and so forth, that are like that. And I think that, if you look more deeply at what it is that drives societies to want democracy, you always end up with a non-economic cause. And for that reason, in the book, I go back to the German philosopher Hegel rather than, to Karl Marx with his economic theories of history. And, the reason for going back to Hegel is that Hegel had a theory of history, a theory of how human societies progress and evolve into higher, forms of organization that was based not on economics, but on what he called the struggle for recognition. That is to say, a completely non-economic goal that we as human beings want to be recognized as, as human beings with a certain dignity and human freedom. And it is that, search for recognition that leads to the relationship of masters and slaves. It's that lies behind, in a certain way, religion. and movements like nationalism, but that ultimately, that's also the way to explain democracy. That's why we want democracy. It's not that it creates capitalist prosperity for us, but that it is a political system that by giving us individual rights, recognizes our dignity as human beings, and that this is the essential driving force behind democratic revolutions, whether they take place in Eastern Europe or in Asia or in Latin America. He lived in the early part of the 19th century and eventually rose to be a professor of philosophy in Berlin in the 1820s. But his life really corresponded to the period of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, 1789, or it began in 1789 and culminated finally in Waterloo in 1815. The French Revolution for Hegel really represented it was the coming of the end of history, so to speak. Now, by the French Revolution, we don't mean just a limited historical event. What we mean is the emergence of what we understand as modern liberal democracy, because in the French Revolution, ultimately, what it was about was a revolution in favor of the principles of liberty and equality. Now, you could substitute the American Revolution for that, because I think, in a kind of ideological sense, those two revolutions were equivalent. I mean, they were both, revolutions to create, what I earlier defined as a liberal democracy, as a political system based on popular sovereignty with, guarantees of individual rights. And for Hegel, the coming of the French Revolution was, the event that heralded the end of history, because it meant that the principles of liberty and equality on which, modern liberal democracy is based had finally been discovered and had been implemented, only in a small corner of Europe back in the late 18th century, but at least the principle was established. And I think, modern Hegelians would argue that what's happened in the 200 years since the French Revolution is, simply the implementation of those principles around the world. And in other words, we haven't progressed, in any fundamental sense since the French Revolution. Well, the reason I decided to do that was that, it all began really with the real world. I mean, we had these remarkable events, that we've been living through in the last few years, the collapse of communism. But, before that, you had a whole series of democratic revolutions in, in Latin America, in Southern Europe, and so forth. And, it raises certain fundamental questions about whether there is such a thing as a, direction to history, and whether, there's some larger process that somehow the newspapers, miss in their day-to-day commentary. And, it turns out that these questions have all been addressed in the past, and they've been addressed by, the greatest minds or the greatest thinkers in the past. And, a philosopher like Hegel has thought about the question of history. I mean, he's thought about the question of whether there is such a thing as progress, whether we can see human society, evolving through a series of stages. And, it's for that reason that I thought that, now in 1992, it's appropriate to go back to, a dead philosopher from a couple hundred years ago, because he's the one that really posed the question, most acutely and provided a certain answer to it. Well, of course, in the course of writing a book, I had to, I had to go back to the original text. A lot of them I hadn't really read since I was in graduate school. When I was a graduate student, I was very much interested in political philosophy, and these were all very live authors, for me in many ways. And so I had lived with them in a certain sense, in all the years when I was doing very, day-to-day, policy-oriented things, the sorts of things they do here in Washington. But really, one of the pleasures of writing the book was the opportunity to go back and reread some of these political philosophers, and indeed to read a number of books that I hadn't read previously, and to actually learn something in the process. I think the other, the other towering figure that is really by far the most important was the German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, and it's from him that the part of the title "The Last Man" comes, because he, in a certain sense, was the philosopher that argued that, well, yes, if there's been historical progress, perhaps, but it's led not to, greater human happiness, but to a total disaster. And in a way, the book is about, you might say, a dialogue between these two philosophers as to, how we ought to evaluate the goodness and how satisfactory is our society at the end of history. I call myself a liberal in the classical sense. That is, I believe in liberal democracy. I believe, very firmly in the need for human beings to govern themselves according to, the rules of constitutional government. In contemporary American politics, in a sense, we're all, liberal Democrats, but I would say that, I tend to favor a kind of strict, sense of that the power of the state ought to be limited in both, politics and economics. Well, he was a philanthropist, and there's a foundation that that was established in his name that has funded the Center for the Study of, essentially, it's the relationship between political philosophy and real world politics at the University of Chicago, that's headed by Professor Bloom. The National Interest is a very small magazine devoted to foreign policy that is published by Irving Kristol. There are two companion journals, the Public Interest and the National Interest, and the Public Interest deals with domestic policy questions, and the National Interest deals with foreign policy. It's, I think he's generally thought of as a so-called neoconservative. That is, someone that became conservative in a certain sense, I think largely for foreign policy reasons, in the course of the 60s and 70s. And that's largely the perspective of the National Interest as well. He was also a student, like I was, of Alan Bloom's back at Cornell, and then he went to the University of Chicago, and he's a close friend of mine who currently works for the U.S. government here in Washington. But there's in a certain sense quite a few of us here in Washington that have this kind of common background where we're involved in nitty-gritty policy issues in our quote-unquote real lives. I mean, that's what our jobs are about. But we've had a background in political philosophy, and we think that those issues are very important, and we want to, and it's very good having that kind of a support group in a certain sense, because you have people that you can bounce these more philosophical ideas off of. My daughter and my son, just 3.5 and 1.5 at the moment. That is a very that was a very hard thing to do in writing this book, because on the one hand, I wanted to address the very difficult philosophical issues. I mean, the question of whether there's a universal history, whether history has a directionality, whether we can say that there's such a thing as the end of history. But on the other hand, I had wanted to make the book accessible to a general reader who was educated, broadly speaking, but not a specialist in either philosophy or political science or any of the topics that I cover. And so, in a way, I had a rather schizophrenic sense of my audience that, on the one hand, it was this general audience, but on the other hand, I knew that there would be a whole battery of specialists, specialists in Hegel and specialists in development theory and economists and sociologists that would also be, there with a microscope analyzing the different, parts of the book that dealt with those specialties as well. So it was a, very challenging thing to do. I think one of the ways that I tried to deal with it is simply by putting the stuff for the specialists in the footnotes, so that the general reader doesn't have to be bothered with references and complicated counter arguments and that sort of thing. So a lot of there's a big apparatus as far as that's concerned, but I tried to stick more to the to the broad arguments that are more generally accessible in the text itself. No, I don't. I know his books, but I don't know him personally. I must say, I mean, from the moment my article was published, it was criticized, virtually by everybody. As I said, some of it on the basis of, I think, simple misunderstanding, but there was no particular, political bias to the criticism. That is to say, conservatives and liberals and people in the center all, took issue with different aspects of it. back in, with the original article, I think conservatives tended to say, well, you shouldn't count communism out, prematurely. There's still a powerful force in the world, that sort of thing. And liberals or people more on the left tended to say, well, this is an inappropriate self-congratulation of, the United States or of liberal democracy or of, the West in general, and it's not really such a perfect society, and, we have a lot of problems yet, and that sort of thing. So it's very hard to, to overinterpret the fact that, the vice president is reading, someone like Paul Johnson and drawing different conclusions because, there are all sorts of political standpoints from which you can come at it. The course of world events has been, just absolutely remarkable and totally unpredictable in the last 5 or 10 years. If you had asked me 10 years ago, when I was training as a professional, Sovietologist or specialist in that part of the world, is it possible that communism could collapse, by the year 1992? Not only communism, but the Soviet Union itself, I would have said, absolutely ridiculous. It represents a viable, legitimate, alternative form of, of government. It's a very strong, internally strong, and, I expect it to be around the rest of my lifetime, and I think virtually everyone else did. And, that's one of the wonderful things about the world right now, is that all of these developments are happening that nobody really anticipated would happen. And as a result, world politics is just, careened off in new directions. I mean, right now in the Soviet Union in Eastern Europe, you're seeing a very major geopolitical transformation, and I don't think anyone can really predict, what's going to come out at the other end of that. The struggle for recognition is, in my view, the motor that drives this process of human history. And it's a concept that comes from Hegel, but I don't think you really need to read Hegel to, to understand it, because there's a very, commonplace, way that it can be understood. That is to say, all human beings, want to be recognized. That is to say, they want other human beings to, affirm their value or their goodness or their dignity or, their freedom. And, according to a philosopher like Hegel, history starts because of a struggle. It begins with a battle, a conflict over recognition, where, in a sense, one caveman gets up and says to the next caveman, I want you to recognize me, that I'm greater than you, I'm your lord and master, and they fight over that. And, according to Hegel, the result of that is a relationship of master and slave, because one of these early men submits and the other, wins the victory. And so you have this very unequal relationship of lord and master that, on the one hand, and slave on the other, that, that grows up. But all of the major phenomenon of, human history can be understood in a certain sense as a form of recognition. I mean, we all want recognition of our own value. For instance, something like contemporary nationalism is not driven by any kind of economic motive. It's driven by the nationalist desire that his nation, his group, his ethnic group, whatever, be recognized as a nation among others. So in Lithuania, for example, we've just seen, a very vivid recent example of this, that, the Lithuanians didn't want, greater wealth, or in fact, their struggle for national independence cost them a lot, in terms of, their wealth and their economic development. What they wanted was recognition of their status as an equal, among other nations. And it's an extremely powerful force. I mean, you can see it, tearing apart Yugoslavia today, that the Croats and the Slovenes, want national recognition. The Serbs in those areas want, recognition for themselves. And so, I think you can see much of the 20th century, all these, nationalist wars as in a way, a manifestation of the same basic desire for recognition, for human recognition. And so it stands at the core of a lot of what's, evil and unjust and leads to violence in our world. Or religion, in a certain sense, can be understood as a form of recognition, because a religious believer wants, other people to recognize his gods and his idols and his, sacred practices. Well, I think, that is the argument, that it is at the core of our humanity that, in a certain sense, that is what makes us human beings, much more so than other aspects. For instance, we have an animal side. We need to sleep, we need to eat, we need shelter, sex, we need a lot of biological sorts of things. But what makes us uniquely human is our desire to be recognized by other people. And this is ultimately what leads us into political life, because politics is really about recognition. It's a struggle for recognition. That is a central paradox of human life, because in a certain sense, if we can achieve what we all want, a perfectly just society where all men are recognized and treated equally, in which there's great material prosperity, in a certain way that robs us of a very important side of life, which is the side that wants to struggle, that wants great causes, that wants to act and to live and to die for ideals, for higher causes, or that somehow wants to transcend, just the satisfaction of the body and its needs and that sort of thing. So I think that's, the essential paradox of, the end of history, or the good life, the good society at the end of history, that, by its very success, it robs man of something that's very important to him. Well, it's, as I said, it's universal, and of course it applies, to me as well as anyone else. Now, I don't struggle for recognition by getting into, battles, literally violent battles. I mean, we're at a different stage of civilization than that. But you can struggle for all sorts of things. I mean, you can struggle to write, the most serious book on politics and philosophy, or, the struggle for recognition, I think, permeates everything, and what makes it important is it's really the basis for any kind of human excellence. That is to say, you don't become, a great pianist or an opera singer unless you, in some sense, want to be recognized as that. That's really the underlying motive that drives people to, to spend all that time in disciplining themselves and practicing and doing things that are extremely difficult. That gets into another complicated issue, which is the quality of recognition, because you can be recognized for all sorts of things. I mean, you can be recognized as a pop star, or you can be recognized as, the greatest, serial killer in North America. I mean, there are all sorts of forms of recognition. And, in the end, you have to ask the question, are there certain forms of recognition that are, inherently more pleasing or more satisfactory than other kinds? And I think that, of course, it's gratifying to be recognized, in the popular press or by the media, or to go on, television, and that sort of thing. But, there's really a higher form of recognition that comes from, a recognition by people that really understand your argument, that can interact with it, that can, appreciate, all of the nuances and the structure and the detail and that sort of thing. And I think that's really the form of recognition that, if you're writing a book of the sort that I've done, I mean, that's, what will be important, unless the, the kind of immediate, sort of pop, pop culture, media kind of recognition. Well, it's still, at this moment a little bit early to say. I think that there, at least, one thing I've been happy about is that there has been a certain recognition that what I'm trying to do is not, simply rehash arguments from a couple of years ago, the question of whether democracy is really breaking out all over the world and that sort of thing, because that's, I think that's a somewhat old argument. But to, move the discussion to, the question of what is the meaning of our democracy now? I mean, should we be happy with it, and what is the reason that we desire democracy? And, to move to questions like the struggle for recognition, is that an appropriate way to understand, what's going on in the world, and why, there have been these democratic revolutions in, in different parts of the world. It's not bad. I think the idea was that it would simply be a striking jacket that would be quickly recognizable, and it has a certain seriousness to it. Not really a plan. I'm going to be talking about this book, in this country, and then it's being published in about 14 foreign countries, at the same time, and so there are going to be little. I mean, that's one of the interesting things about this particular idea, is it stirred a comparable degree of debate and controversy, and a lot of places outside the United States as well. And I think that's, that's going to preoccupy me. But I will be, continue to be interested in this general problem of democracy and, where it fits into our contemporary world. Thumos is, it's a Greek word that comes from Plato that represents a certain part of the soul, that it is a part of the soul, or, to put it in modern terms, it's a part of the personality or the part of the human psyche that precisely demands recognition. And, according to Plato, there are three parts of the soul. There's the desiring part, so we understand what that is. It's like the, the part that desires food and water and so forth. And there's reason, human capacity to calculate and to, to make decisions based on fundamental logic, this sort of thing. But Plato says that there's a third part of the soul, which is Thumos, which essentially is, in a way, it's the source of self-esteem. It's the valuing part of the soul. It's the part of the soul that says, yes, I am a human being, I have a certain dignity or worth, and I am proud of that worth. And it's impossible really to reduce, any understanding of human psychology simply to desire and reason alone. And, there's a very important assertive side of the human personality that, that wants recognition and demands, that other people recognize me at, at my worth, at my understanding of what I'm worth. Now, megalothymia is a word, it's another Greek word, but one that I made up myself. Megalos in Greek means great, and thumia, refers to thumos. And megalothymia is a word meaning the desire to be recognized as greater than other people. And in my view, this is, in a way, the sense of both things that are good about politics and things that are bad about it, because a tyrant is, in a way, a prototype of the person that wants to be recognized as greater. I think, when you understand, these great entrepreneurs or founders of big industrial empires, what's going on is not, simply, as is commonly portrayed, greedy people wanting more and more. I mean, it really comes out of this part of the soul that's called Thumos. I mean, they want recognition. A guy like Ted Turner, at this point, I mean, in his career, he has all the money that he can possibly use. I mean, what he wants is, I don't know if it's being Times Man of the Year exactly, but, he wants people to think of him in a certain way, that, he's the man that founded CNN, that created an entirely new media business that, has done something that the networks could never do. I mean, that's pure recognition. If you say that, we are potentially threatened by would-be tyrants that have this megalothymia, that want to be recognized as greater, it is much safer if they become Ted Turners than if they become, let's say, politicians or military, people that will, turn their desire to be recognized as greater into, some political, movement or cause. In a way, it would have been much better if, if Hitler had stayed out of politics and gone into the sign painting business and then become the Ted Turner of, of house painting in Germany in the 1920s. I mean, he would have made a lot of money. He may have gotten quite recognized as a very innovative, house painter, whatever. And we would have been spared, a lot of the fascist politics of that period. And I think that, part of the wisdom of the American founding was an understanding that, this kind of business activity would be able to absorb the talents and ambitions of, of people that were inclined in that fashion, but turn it to a kind of public good so that, they produce wealth for, the rest of society. But the main thing is that they're kept in an occupation that uses their ambitions and talents and gives it a certain outlet without creating a political tyranny as a result. I think you can see that, in our country, that we have a constitutional system that is essentially designed to constrain ambitious people. It's designed to constrain people with megalothymia, the Napoleon or the Stalin or the Saddam Hussein that, would enter American politics and want to, turn it into some kind of a, dictatorship. And that's why we have this system of checks and balances and the three branches of government and that sort of thing to constrain political ambition. First of all, ambition is pushed into the area of business and economic activity. And for those that are not satisfied by it, they have, the system where they have to go around as they're doing in New Hampshire, kissing babies and promising, voters, that they'll deliver on certain goods, but completely constrained by a system of law, that forces their political energies into certain very safe, and well, perhaps not productive, but at least not terribly harmful directions. And that's, in a way, the genius of our political system. I was really a foreign policy specialist, and it seemed to me that the gravest issues, at that time were those of war and peace, U.S.-Soviet relations, the arms race, instability in the Middle East, that sort of thing. I worked, several bureaucratic layers down from him, but I was a member of the policy planning staff and worked on, at that time, mostly on Middle Eastern issues. I was one level up, but in a way, in a more central role, because I was working on Soviet, U.S.-Soviet relations and German unification and a variety of issues like that. Well, I don't know. When I quit the government to write this book, I had always intended to go back into government, when it was over. But in a certain way, I've had such a good time writing it that I think that maybe that I'd like to do more of it. That is a it's a chapter that is in the section that describes what the struggle for recognition is, and the important point that I was trying to make in that section is that in a way the real problem with communism, with communist societies, was not that they were economically inefficient or didn't produce a West German standard of living for East Germans. The problem was a kind of moral one, that it forced people to make compromises with themselves, with their Thumos in a way was compromised. They could not rise above themselves, precisely because these communist governments dangled a kind of consumer culture in front of them. It wasn't a very rich consumer culture, but they dangled things like a better apartment or a refrigerator or possibly a car or a vacation in Bulgaria. I mean, that's their equivalent of the Grand Bahamas, in front of people. And it said, look, if you people want to be parts of this system, if you want to have a successful career, if you want to get along, if you want your vacation in Bulgaria, then you have to sign this petition denouncing your colleagues, or you have to shut up, when you see someone being, unjustly persecuted by the party, and that sort of thing. And, I think if you look at the writings of someone like Václav Havel, you'll see that that's precisely what he identifies as the real evil of the system. I mean, it wasn't that, it produced shoddy goods and no food on the shelves. It was that morally it was a bankrupt system, because it really made people accept this Faustian bargain, in a sense, to trade away their souls for the sake of a few, meager consumer goods. He tells this very, amusing story in a essay that he wrote while he was still in jail called The Power of the Powerless, in which a greengrocer hangs a sign in front of his window that says, "Workers of the world unite," and Havel goes into some of the psychology behind why he should do a thing like that. And he said, well, does he really believe that the workers of the world should unite? And he says, well, no. The real reason that the greengrocer did it is that he's afraid. He's afraid that if he doesn't put that sign in his window, then the communist authorities will come and, they will harass him or threaten him with jail or various other, terrible things that they could do to him. And Havel says, what the sign really says, if you can look beneath the surface, is not "Workers of the world unite." It is, "I am afraid. I am a humble greengrocer living in this political system, and I know that if I don't go along, I will suffer the consequences, and therefore I'm obedient, and I want to show my superiors that I'm obedient." And so in a way, I mean, this is a way of his demonstrating, the moral complicity that was required to, live in that kind of society. And he said that, people could avoid facing up to that because they put up a high-minded slogan like "Workers of the world unite," and they, because of ideology, they could tell themselves, well, I'm not really compromising my moral worth. What I'm doing is, saying some high-minded slogan. But nonetheless, that compromise existed, and that was the real, that was the evil of the system. No, I haven't used any of my Greek in probably 10 years now. What I learned was not modern Greek, but Attic Greek, which was the Greek that they used in 5th century Athens. And today, nobody really knows how that was pronounced or spoken. and it's quite a bit different from modern Greek, but I could read it pretty well. Well, I can speak French and a bit of Russian, and then I know, a smattering of other languages. I think that they are in for a terrible time, not on a political level, because I think that, with the decline, the disappearance of the Soviet Union, the emergence of Russia and these other republics, they've achieved a certain, certain way, a kind of precondition for the emergence of real democracy in that region. But the real problem is going to be this terrible, terrible economic transition, that I think everybody has agreed in that part of the world that they would like to be, a capitalist, a prosperous capitalist country like West Germany or France. The trouble is that to get from here to there requires, now this period of price, liberalization and inflation, and, a country that doesn't have any, food on the table. So I am actually rather pessimistic in the short run as to, what's going to happen in that part of the world. I expect that there could well be, many further political explosions as people, simply don't have a way to feed their families. Well, if you understand it in the specific sense that I have, yes, it's certainly been here, but it's been here for a good 200 years, and we just haven't realized it. Thank you.